Rogier Gregoire. I'm 84. I never thought that I would live this long. Back in the day when ages were critical, someone said, well, don't trust anyone over 40. It's intriguing that when I stand here before you and I realize what an extraordinary life I've had, that there's so many things that I no longer say. Just as a footnote, I spent Thanksgiving with my 4 children and their 5 grandchildren, and it was a seminal event for me. I listened to all of them. I thought I wanted to come and say things to them, which was important. And in fact, I had the most important event was that it instilled in me the notion that I needed to listen to them even more carefully than I had ever done before. And what I heard was the litany of love and affection that they held for me over all these years, and all my missteps and errors and problems that I bestowed upon them as their father and grandfather. I just should say something a little autobiographical about myself. So I was born in New York City of Jamaican parents. I was a first-generation American in 1934. And the first real thing that I remember is coming back from the World's Fair on Long Island and coming into the kitchen at our home, and my mother turning on the radio and listening to Franklin Delano Roosevelt say that we were at war. This was December 7th. That's the real first cogent memory I have in my life. So you can see that for a lot of the people in this room, it was before most of you were born. Although not a lot. I'm one of the club members here. These are. I see faces here that I have seen all my life when you were younger. I know you all well as I get old as well. At any rate, autobiographically, I grew up. My mother, who flirted with many religious tones, Buddhism, Islam, was a Rosicrucian. If any of you know what a Rosicrucian was a Rosicrucian back when Rosicrucians was a really important thing, because she was intellectually obsessed with the divine in her life. And so she put me in a Catholic school, and I went through Catholic school in New York City. It's quite amazing. But I was, if you can imagine it, I was a really terrible teenage kid. And my single mother sent me to Tuskegee, Alabama to live with friends because she thought that I was going wild on the streets of New York City. And she was right. Anyway, I went to Tuskegee, Alabama, and I left my Catholicism in a segregated church in Montgomery, outside of Montgomery, Alabama. I went to the first Mass, and there was obviously a place where people of color sat in a church, in a Catholic church. I'd never heard of anything like this. I was so obsessed by this notion that it ended my relationship with the Catholic Church in ways which I have not enthusiastically tried to repair. When I got back to New York City and finished my last year, not at the Catholic high school that I originally went to, but to a public school, I was lucky enough to get connected with Burroughs Corporation on my graduation, and I started work on the very first commercial computer in the United States, Burroughs 2000, in 1952, and it changed my life. For the next 12 years or so, I was a programmer, a high school graduate, but a programmer, because programming is not about the sort of things the most professional, and besides, it was an experiment. You know, programming is an experiment, constant experiment with the reality in front of you. It's about asking hard questions about why did you do that, and what is the result of that? And the computer does that, it says it back to you. It's the notion of inquiry at a profoundly powerful level, and it changed my life as well. It led, eventually, for me to go to move from New York City. And by the way, there are lots of things about my, at 84, boy, I could spend a lot of the time telling you about me, but I want to talk about dialogue. So really quickly, I want to say that there are some things in my life which were profound and mysterious. I had an intimate and powerful relationship with Buckminster Fuller. He was, in many ways, the father that I always wanted to have, and a man who really infused me with the notion that asking good questions was more important than the facts the questions produced. The good questions were transformative. And when I, as you'll find out in a couple of seconds, when I eventually came to Massachusetts, and I was tutoring middle school students in the Roxbury High School, where there were mostly children of color, someone heard about the work that I was doing with computers and young kids, and mentioned me to the dean of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University, and they heard about the work that I was doing, the fact that I was, in fact, training middle school children to be programmers, to write code, to write down their thoughts in an organized and reasonable way, in a syntax and a grammar that they could then recall and use effectively. That's essentially what programming is about. And so I was invited to come to Harvard with a high school diploma. And so my wife said to me, you can't go to a doctoral program at Harvard. You're only a graduate. You have to go tell them the truth. So I went, and I said to Ted Sizer, I said, I'm sorry, but I have to refuse your offer because I only have a high school diploma and I can't go into a graduate program. And he was astounded that this was the case, that I was both eloquent and mostly because of my anti-religious and inquisitive notions about what the nature of reality was. I read incessantly, I was constantly asking questions, I was constantly bugging the world about what the nature of this is. What is this? And then my mother infected me with the notion of asking the second question, and those two questions, which I'm now, in fact, in many ways, here standing before you to talk about. The first question is, what is this? Which I think this group has always been asking about, what is this? And the question my mother introduced into my life is, who am I? Who are you? Not what people say you are, but what are you asking about yourself that defines your identity about who you are? What is the voice in your head that raises you to the level of inquiry, that says, who are you? That no one intervenes in, that you hold quietly with yourself as you go to sleep at night. This is what this dialogue is about. Who am I? It's the question we all ask ourselves. And whatever the answer is, it affirms the great, extraordinary notion of human diversity. The strength of humanity is our diversity. As I look out at this room, there's so many different faces, so many wonderful people who, by the way, I'm getting old, so I don't always remember things. I apologize. But lots of you have met me on the street and smiled at me as if you remembered me either from here or some other meeting, and I didn't remember you. Please accept my apologies for not remembering. I'm trying not to remember anything anymore. So I brought notes. On the table there's a front page to this document. This was a proposal for a book I wanted to write 30 years ago. It's called In Search of Cohesiveness. And so I want to talk about this notion of dialogue. The original dialogue really means through the word. That's the Greek English translation of the term dialogue. It's through the word. And Socrates, in the 3rd century, in his time, I apologize for not being so accurate, like with numbers and stuff like that. I don't think about those things anymore, and I don't want to confuse you with whether it was the 3rd century or 3,000 years or whatever. When Socrates was alive, the aristocracy had Phoenician script, and they were learned in the sense that they could write letters to each other. But the ordinary people had to memorize everything. The Iliad, which was written 1,200 years before Socrates' time, was the educational memory of almost any learned middle person in Greece. No one, they all had to remember it. A poem, a huge lyric poem. And so Socrates suggested that people ought to go and talk with each other. And dialogue is about this conversation that we have with one another, when we look at each other in the eye and say what we say to one another, when we cannot hide from those people around us by putting up a Facebook or something, these things. And the plethora of jokes about these electronic things which keep us away from each other, from seeing how beautiful that we really look and how much we're touched by another human being looking at us with true and open affection. It seems to be disintegrating in this electronic snowstorm in front of us. That we no longer, I have to tell you that once a week when we can, sometimes because of my friend Charles Gessert and I get together for an hour, a little bit more than an hour, depends on how it is. I have these little footnotes I have to enter into this, so I apologize. And we talk with one another once a week for an hour. It's extraordinary because I have no one else. Everyone else thinks that I'm whatever they think I am. And I've been able to fool him. And so it's a wonderful thing to have someone to talk to and to listen to hear what they have to say, to have them unfold their own lives in front of you. It's extraordinary. In the Catholic Church, they would call that a sacrament, a kind of communion that we have with one another. I remember some of this language, so I apologize for using it recklessly in a group of freethinkers. I know you'll forgive me. About 50 years ago, I encountered this thing about dialogue. I encountered people who are openly trying to resuscitate the notion that we should talk to each other, that we should share our common notion of what we were as human beings, what cohesiveness held us together, what great natural embrace drew us to one another so that we smiled even if we did not know someone. Many of you, by the way, I have seen on the streets, and you've just not said, hello, whatever your name is, but smiled at me. And I knew it was a familiar smile. It was a lover's smile. It's the kind of thing you look up from the dishes and you turn to the woman or man that lives next to you and you smile. And we know instantly the huge, huge traverse of emotions and human existence that lies between washing a cup and saying, I love you. I say that because it's that connectivity that I find in this room almost every time I come here. It's that sense that I am a human being. I am a human being. That transcends everything, the color of my skin, my age, my height, my intellectual life, my inability to dance, and whatever. So I've come to you to talk about dialogue. It's a lost art. At each of the tables, I tried to leave a resume of a short introduction to the larger piece, which is on the website, by the way. Is that correct? So I ask you to read that because it's my outline of the book I would have written 50 years ago. It has not changed essentially in 50 years. I don't, there's some things about it. I find little places where I put in articles and prepositions and things that I ought not to have, just for literary clarity. In other words, but I think you'll go by that. I was smarter then anyway. So a man now whose name somehow slips away from me, who was a devotee of Albert Einstein at Princeton, thought he abandoned nuclear basic physics, nuclear physics. He was Einstein's protege, and I may even remember his name before this is all over, but it's unimportant at this point. And thought that we ought to return to a society in which people spoke to each other, that we shared our common interests. Not in huge arenas, but 10, 15 people sitting and talking with one another, sharing their perceptions of reality, listening and learning to one another with affection, and hearing quietly and persuasively what it meant to be a human being from the broader concept than their own experience. Do you see what I'm saying? We have, no matter how many of you young folks have had great and interesting lives, you have more years in this room than you can conceive of. Great stories, trivial and majestic and wonderful stories of your lives that I wish I could come and listen to. I could put my head in your laps and hear what you have to say about the world around you. Every now and then it comes up. I hope you'll indulge me. So at one point at Thanksgiving dinner, my granddaughter, I was sitting on the couch, and my granddaughter, who, by the way, is really bright, and she's at Bronx High School of Science, and she's smart as hell, and she's probably smarter than anybody else in the whole family. But she doesn't like to talk to us because we're too dumb. Well, that's a pejorative. I didn't mean it. She tolerates a lot, but what she did was to put her head in my lap, just for a moment, and I put my hand on her head, and it was just a second, but it was an act of intimacy over generations, which I can't even. If you have grandchildren, you must know how lovely it is. And most of the time, they just tolerate us, but to actually have that intimate touch of your granddaughter, 16 years old, pretty as a picture, smart as hell, tolerating an old 84-year-old man by putting her head in his lap. I can now feel that. I know I can see in your faces you know what I'm talking about. I want to I thought that there was lots of stuff that I could go over here. There's some things here which are really important to say. Usually in our conversations, not dialogues, we have a combative structure. We want to say what is better than or less than or different than someone else's point of view. And we don't ask questions of each other with affection and openness about, I'd like to know more about what you're doing and what that's about. Our lives are so pell-mell that in order to hold up with this thing, you have to have one of these things. I see young people walking on the streets like this. And there are a plethora of jokes about families sitting at the table, each of them with their cell phones next to them and texting each other rather than talking. It is, I may be too late to say wish we could sit and talk. I may be too late for anyone to ever hear an old 84-year-old black man from Harlem say, He wants to come and listen to what you have to say to him, that he's still capable of listening. He'd rather listen because he cannot remember all the things that the 84 years have stuck in his head, and so he would like to listen to what your 84 years have done, your 64 years, your 50 years, your whatever. He'd like to recover his age of 50 when some of you are now in your 50s and enjoying it. I'd like to know what that's like. And so I come and listen a lot. I listen to Charles. He's smarter than I am. He's a doctor. I'm a doctor too, but I deal with intangibles. It's important that human beings find ourselves, that we find ourselves in other human beings, that we turn and see in another human being something that glorifies and makes majestic the notion of human being. We need not fight with each other anymore. We should come and listen and tell the stories which have bound people together for generations, all over the planet, not just with Native Americans, but every society on the planet. People sit and talk with each other for a time in order to resuscitate the notion that they belong, that they are not just themselves alone, but they belong to a larger and majestic event, that they are exquisite, that someone will turn and listen to you, and you can speak to them and they will listen to you. I don't want to go on much longer. I had great plans for this, that I would ask you to have a dialogue with me, but I don't know how to do this. And in fact, I'd always wanted to bring dialogue to this town, because when I came to Duluth, I was really unsettled, and I didn't want to come here. My wife, whose grandchildren are here, and she has young grandchildren, and I have this young wife. She's in her 60s somewhere. For which I'm grateful, because she recognizes, and she loves me, I love her, and she's brought me to this place where I have found many friends and wonderful things. And we were, in the first week we were here, we went by down the street and we saw this monument, Clayton Jackson McGee Monument on First Street, and I was shocked that someplace somebody had memorialized, had remembered such an atrocious event that separated us from 3 other human beings in ways which were just unconscionable. And so I realized that I could live here, because if the people could do this, this was a fine place for humanity. It's the one church in many ways that I still think of. When I drive by there, I stop for a moment and I look at what has been set up there. And if there's someone else walking by, we stop and chat for a moment about how this is majestic or wonderful or whatever it is. And I listen to what they have to say and I nod quietly. And I try to be not as obstreperous as I can normally be, as I am now, for example. I want to tell you that, to get back to the issue of dialogue, the dialogue is not an easy thing to do because of the cultural imperatives that have now been imposed on us human beings. Things like television, which keeps us looking at this thing in order, and our mind is going like crazy, but there's a thing there, and it separates us from one another. Here I am in a room full of my colleagues and people my age, in which you stop to listen to me. I can't tell you how extraordinary it is for me to stand here and look out at you and say thank you for letting me say these few simple words about being a human being. I ask you to have conversations with other people in your lives, have dialogues, ask them who they are and what they're doing. don't judge them. And if you don't understand them, treat yourself to the luxury of maybe saying, I should try and understand this. That maybe it's my flaw, not theirs. And see if you can use that impetus to erase from your own mind the notion that you know best as an act of transformation. The single most critical aspect of being a human being is our ability to be transformed. From the moment we're born, we engage in the process of becoming who we should be. And although I do not know who I should be yet, I'm still here struggling with the notion. But it started when I was very young. I asked first, what is this? And whatever someone told me about, or what I discovered what this is, it led me to ask the question, who asked that question? Who in me raised the question about what is this? Because I want to know that person intimately. It has driven me all my life to ask the question about who am I? I ask you to ask that question of yourselves. Love is the most transformative event in our lives. It erases any barriers we have to the world around us. Surely and slowly, it envelops us in the arms of the rest of humanity. Love is the opportunity to be transformed into who you should be, who you have always been. I see more and more in people like my friend Charles Gesser, the divine. Every now and then, in our most heated arguments, when we disagree completely about something, he looks at me in a way that I'm certain that God is within him, and that he is trying to reveal that God to me, as I am trying to reveal the God that I hardly have as good a relationship with as he has with his, my own divinity. I'm trying to become divine. I'm trying to become more than I am right now in front of you. And I want to thank you for helping me get this far.